Every house on my street had its windows thrown wide with light that night, candles on mantels, strings of bulbs blinking like patient stars. Every house but one. I'm the kind of neighbor who notices the little things: a milk carton left out, a delivery truck that comes at the wrong hour, the way a lawn chair tilts after a storm. So when I saw the Donnelly house dark against all that Christmas glare, it cut through me like a wrong note. It wasn't the absence of light as much as what that absence meant: a silence where noise should be, an open door where there should have been a welcome. This episode is about nights like that. 6 stories where the holiday illusion of warmth is brittle and thin, where thresholds stop meaning safety and start meaning exposure. We begin with the house that should have been full of people and instead looked like someone left mid-meal and never came back. I want you to listen like you're standing on that snowy porch. Imagine the steam of a turkey gone cold, the half-empty wine glasses, a child's mitt keep the dead weight of an ordinary night from letting you look away. I knocked, on the wood, not too hard, and put my ear to the jamb. The sound that answered was the kitchen clock, thin and ordinary, and the distant hum of the street. No voices. I had keys. I had reasons to worry, but not to cross other people's thresholds without permission. So I did what anyone would do. I peered through the living room window. The table was set for 5. Silverware in meat beds, plates with flecks of gravy, a centerpiece of pine and cranberries that already looked thirsty. A chair was tipped back as if someone had stood up mid-sentence. A child's coloring page lay face down on the placemat, pencil strokes smudged like fingerprints. A single yellow lamp burned on the sideboard, casting the room in a weary, domestic glow. Through the glass, the sight felt obscene, a private scene made public by my stare. I remember thinking the worst and then trying not to. Maybe they went out for a walk and would come back laughing, scolding me for worrying. Maybe the oven had been left on and they'd stepped out to air the house. Maybe the television had gone to static and they'd gone to check the circuit. My brain made these small, reasonable concessions, like someone fumbling for a life preserver. The knob turned under my hand the first time I tried. Warmth leaked out, then cold. The door was cracked enough to slip inside, and when I did, the smell hit me. Turkey fat and cranberry, cloth-stiff sugar, the sharp chemical of a cleaner someone used once a week. Not the smell of a fight, not the smell of smoke or blood. It was domestic. It was ordinary. It was wrong. There was a half-eaten plate at one seat. The gravy was crusted where a fork had been dragged through it. A napkin, folded and wrinkled, lay under a bread roll. One of the chairs had a glove on the armrest, and the table settings were still warm to the touch. I could see footprints in the thin dust on the floor, leading toward the back door, and then trails in the snow outside that wandered toward the alley and faded. I almost laughed, the absurdity of expecting the footprints to lead me to an explanation. Upstairs, I found coats on hooks, a small collection of mismatched shoes, and a child's stuffed bear propped on the top step like a sentinel. The child's bedroom was neat, bed made, nightlight on. On the dresser, a Polaroid lay face up, the Donnellys on last year's porch, brand new snow, smiles like paper. If they had left in a hurry, everything else said they had left politely. Plates suggested dinner interrupted, not catastrophe. I called 911 with the trembling in my voice that only comes when you've crossed an invisible line. The operator asked the usual questions, then kept asking over me. She told me to wait where I was. I remember standing by the door and thinking how the lamplight softened the edges of the room, how the ornaments on the tree winked like private witnesses. It felt like the house was holding its breath. By the time the first cruiser rolled up, the sky had lost the last of its blue. Sergeant Morales and Officer Kent, 2 names I'll never forget because they were there when it mattered, ducked into the low warmth of the house like doctors into an emergency ward. They moved with polite efficiency, checking rooms, calling out names, then no one answered. The smell of my breath, the fog on the inside of the window, the way my hands were clasped to keep from touching anything, all of that made me feel smaller than I had the right to be. They found the back door ajar. There were tracks in the snow, 2 sets, one small, one larger, leading to a delivery alley behind the row of houses. Someone had moved through that alley and into the dark. Within days, the story exploded.
Neighbors I had never spoken to marched up and down the block, hands in pockets, faces hard as if they had been punched. Local reporters came with cameras and microphones, asking questions that felt like scrapes. Someone leaked a grainy clip from the Donnelly's doorbell camera, and that clip lived longer than anyone expected. In it, a hooded figure moving with a deliberate, unhurried gait across the porch light flickering, then the figure reaching the door and disappearing inside. Nothing else. No face, no sound, no explanation. Detective Ruiz was assigned to the case. He had a way of looking at you that made it clear he was sorting you into categories: witness, person of interest, collateral. He interviewed me for hours. He asked me if I had heard anything, if I knew of anyone the Donnellys were feuding with, whether their marriage was troubled. I gave him nothing useful. I gave him everything I could remember. He asked for the list of people who had keys.
He asked if anyone else had been on the porch. He asked if we had surveillance. He asked the questions that leave you exposed because they are questions you cannot control. For weeks, the neighborhood felt like a crime scene that was too polite to ask people to leave. People left casseroles on stoops with handwritten notes. The police taped off the porch for a day while evidence technicians took photographs of crumbs and a scuff on the rug, and the small, chilling impression of someone's work boot. The media made a meal of the empty chair at the table. By the time the public had furnished itself with an opinion, the family had become an emblem, Christmas gone wrong. Days turned into a slow, tight-lipped investigation. Detective Ruiz, with the case folder that smelled faintly of coffee and paper, sent samples to labs and checked registry logs and ran fingerprints through systems. He kept me up to date because I was the person who had found the scene. He called me in with updates like a reluctant pen pusher, and sometimes he called just to say there'd been nothing to report. Then, 2 weeks after the discovery, the phone rang at 6 in the morning. I had not slept properly since I left that house. Sleep felt obscene. Detective Ruiz's voice was not triumphant. It was like someone telling you the weather. Factual, efficient, unacceptable. They had a match on DNA found under one of the Donnelly's fingernails, a partial profile that matched a man named Curtis Bellamy. It had come back from a lab across state lines. His name had threads attached to it, previous arrests, a record that made him searchable. Not to a murderer yet. To the police, he was someone whose path had crossed statistics in the wrong ways. When they took him in, he didn't put up a spectacle. He sat with his hands visible, like a man who knew what the rules of surrender were. In the interview room, he spoke quietly. He confessed. He said the words in a tone I couldn't place. Not hysterical, not angry, just matter of fact. The media called him a monster. Neighbors called him a name that was huskier and meaner than any legal term, and the police called it a resolution. No story is neat. That one, in particular, had corners frayed with things that never sit well under a light. He confessed to being there that night. He confessed to what seems to have happened inside the Donnelly house. But the confession could not entirely bridge the space between physical proof and human questions. Why them? How long had he been watching? Had anyone seen him before and just not known what they'd seen? There were interview transcripts and court filings, and a prosecutor's statement that read like glass. In the end, there was enough for an arrest and a conviction. But conviction is a legal end, not a healing, and it cut the neighborhood in half. People needed closure like you need a bandage, and a trial gave them one. A name, a date, a sentence to repeat. The rest, the ways we continued to look over our shoulders, the way the sound of a lid dropping in the kitchen made the hair on our arms go up, stayed longer than the breath of the court. For me, the aftermath was both public and painfully private. I had, in the beginning, thought it noble to be the one who knocked. Do the right thing, I told myself. Call someone, get help. But the quiet attention that followed was corrosive. Friends asked me questions I didn't want to answer. Strangers on message boards inferred things about my relationship with the Donnellys that were untrue and more cruel. The clip from the doorbell ended up on late-night shows, framed as unsettling footage, and my face showed up in more places than the family's privacy could bear. Every time the case was mentioned, my name was somewhere near the start of the sentence. Then came the letters. At first, they were notes of thanks and casseroles, then postcards from people who wished to offer opinions, and finally a few thin threats that came on Monday afternoons, stamped and indifferent. The house where I'd knocked became a lens that magnified every fault in my life. It exposed me in a way that made me take stock,
of my own home, of who I trusted. I moved within a year, not because the Donnellys' house felt haunted. It never felt haunted so much as compromised, but because every time I passed that darkened porch, I felt a small shame, like I had failed at vigilance, or like my obligation to my neighbors had been turned into a performance to be judged. Detective Ruiz visited the neighborhood during the trial. He spoke in measured sentences that were not for us so much as for the tape and the record. He said the investigation had been thorough, that the match had been corroborated with other evidence, that the confession had sealed what the lab had begun. He recommended community watch programs. He recommended vigilance. He recommended politely and infuriatingly that we carry on with our lives. I tried. I learned to practice normal gestures with exaggerated care. I went to Christmas Mass the following year and found the empty chair in a pew and felt the wrongness of it all again like a physical shove. The Donnellys' house got a new family months after the trial. The new curtains were a lighter shade. The new family stacked their life in a way that suggested an attempt to sew the torn seams of the block back together. They left their lights on that first Christmas and watched as the neighbors watched them. It should have been a hopeful thing, renewal, and yet the light felt like a thin coat of varnish over something that could not be smoothed. When I speak about that night now, I try to make two things clear. First, what I saw that evening was not spectacular in the cinematic sense. No broken windows, no dramatic blood, no cinematic struggle. It was small, domestic, and therefore more unsettling because it suggested an intimacy violated rather than a battle won or lost.
Second, there is a cost to involvement. Doing what seemed right, calling the police, staying on the scene, testifying in court, put me at the center of a story I never asked to be part of. That center has weight. If you were listening and wondering whether you would act, whether you'd knock or call or walk away, know this: the weight of action is real. It changes you, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. The Donnelly case gave us an answer in statute and sentencing. It did not give us back dinners or a sense of absolute safety on our block. It left a residue of mistrust that clung to our holiday lights like soot. If this kind of deep dive into true Christmas horrors is your thing, and you want more where this came from, like and subscribe. It helps the channel keep telling these stories. I'm not asking for more than that. Just stay. There's more to tell. Thresholds, doors, porches, the thin swing of a screen keep showing up in these stories because that's where the ordinary world meets the outside. It is where trust is negotiated. Do I open the door to neighborly cheer, or am I opening to the wrong kind of person? The next story is about a threshold of a different kind, a will in the hands of a dying man, and a family dinner that was intended as closure, but was designed by someone who knew the family better than anyone to reveal and to ensnare. Uncle Ray's place sits 3 hours away in a hollowed part of the state where the trees lean in like judges. The house had a low, sagging porch and a smell like smoke and old coffee. You could tell where the house had once been white under decades of peeling. The paint had a look of someone who had given up on being pretty. He'd called everyone in the family, the people he'd known since childhood, the cousins and siblings and their kids, and told them to be there on Christmas Eve. He said there would be no funeral. He said he wanted us together to set things straight. I knew Uncle Ray mostly through summers and bad jokes. He had a laugh like gravel. He wore a cap shaped to his head and always sat in the same chair. He'd had money once, modest, the kind that buys a few niceties and a lot of pride. In his later years, he was thinner and deferential to his own memories, as if memory was a currency he had to manage carefully. He invited us all because he'd written a note that said he needed witnesses. He left an envelope for the person he trusted most. The line read straightforward, almost businesslike. You are to read this in front of everyone. We drove down narrow roads rimmed with ice, the cars breathing their own fog, and I remember the house's small sounds, the clock, the creak of the stairs, the smell of gravy and something sweet in a pan. It should have been ordinary, a man gathering his family to pass his last wishes. Instead, it felt like a stage being set. The envelope was thick, the paper cheap, and folded with care.
Inside were instructions that read like an executor's checklist, the names of who was to receive what, the schedule, where to sign. It also contained a letter to us, his family, that took on a tone I can only describe as performative. He wrote about legacies and honesty, and about truth being more important to him than money. There was a list of grudges, thinly veiled. He asked us to be impartial witnesses to his decisions. What he didn't announce in the note was that he had scheduled the cards in his hand. He made it clear that no one was to leave the table until everyone had spoken. The house's back door had a padlock we didn't notice until it was late and the snow had begun to close in. The truth is, most of us don't look for locks at a family dinner. We look for the gravy boat. The table was laid out like an accusation. Glassware glittered. The windows reflected faces more than scenery. Old wounds came up in the banal way that family wounds do. Someone joked about money. Someone else countered with an old slight, and the conversation deepened into old resentments. His daughter Gail, sharp, with an edge I had seen before, moved the conversation with the accuracy of a surgeon. She was the kind of person who remembers dates like they are coordinates. She held a folder the way someone holds a weapon. The paper was creased where she'd thumbed it. At one point, Uncle Ray, who still had the startling ability to be lucid when it suited him, tapped his spoon against the side of his glass. The sound was small, but stopped the conversation the way a starting pistol stops runners. He read a passage that named his heirs, his bequests, and then he asked Gail to present something she'd found. She did not hesitate. The folder had test results in it, toxicology reports, clean and official on letterhead, and when Gail set them down in the center of the table the way you set down a verdict, the room tilted. She read aloud a list of substances and timings, and the word toxicology hung there like a bell. I remember a cousin laughing too loudly, someone else looking at the ceiling as if it might offer an explanation. Gail's voice didn't rise when she spoke. She had made a claim against the people who stood on either side of the table, and that claim was precise. She implied that the cause of Uncle Ray's decline was not simply age, but interference. There was a quiet, accumulating disbelief. People ask for straightforward things on their deathbed. We don't expect the bedside to turn into a coroner's office. Then he stood up to protest. That was the moment I felt the temperature in the room change. He was older, but not entirely helpless. He said he needed time to think. He held the envelope to his chest like a shield, as if he could keep his final will from being read if he simply closed himself around it. And for a minute, maybe for two, we thought that would be the end.
He would sleep, we would leave. The family would disperse with the heavy, sticky quiet that families leave behind. Instead, the doors were closed from the outside. The padlock clicked. Someone's car tires crunching on the drive were gone. The phones in pockets found no signal. The little domestic theater turned inward into a pressure cooker. We were not, as the note had implied, impartial witnesses. We were captives. You have to understand, it's not only the lock that imposes violence, it's the change of conditions. It is the realization that the room is now a container where the truth is being forced out like air from a punctured lung. People began to shift in their chairs. A daughter accused another of taking money. A sister accused someone of meddling with prescriptions. The test results that Gail had shown were interpreted like a map of intent. Fingers pointed. Voices rose, not in sudden screams, but like old mechanics that had long ago rusted loose and were now being squeezed until they snapped. At one point, Uncle Ray's eyes fixed on me with a clarity that made me feel seen and small at the same time. He mouthed something I couldn't hear. It was either regret or instruction. I moved to the window and saw, in the reflection, our faces like a jury arrayed. The light from outside was thin and indifferent. It was Christmas Eve, and the world outside the locked doors carried on. Inside, we argued. Gail's evidence was technical and cold. The toxicology showed an ingestion pattern that suggested some form of poisoning over time. Small doses, concealed as medicine perhaps, the kind that aged bodies might attribute to infirmity. But it was only evidence on paper. It required interpretation and motive. It required an answer to the question that hangs in the air like a last cigarette smoke. Who benefits?
Accusations are blunt instruments. They don't fit the exacting shape of human complexity. And Francine, who had always been a model of social niceties, went red as a beet when the suggestion of interference fell on her. Her husband broke down in a sob that made the room sound like a house collapsing in an earthquake. We argued in clipped sentences, in the code of family fights where love and grievance share the same breath. And then, mid-argument, Uncle Ray's face went slack. For the first time, the theoretical discussion became practical and immediate. He slumped forward, and the silverware clinked against the plate. Someone called out. Someone tried to move him. He wouldn't wake. Gail's hands were on his chest as if she could press the truth into his ribcage. The room moved with the frantic choreography of people who suddenly have to be practical, find a phone, seek help, take his pulse. But the padlock was still on the back door, and it felt for a moment as though the house had decided to hold its own counsel. People began to panic. Keys that had hung on hooks were suddenly precious. The locked porch felt like a noose.
Someone pounded on the door until the neighbors turned up with torches and demands. Someone else, in a voice that was half hopeful and half brokered, said that we ought to call an ambulance first and call a lawyer later. Practicality resumed, but the fabric of the dinner was torn. They took Uncle Ray to the hospital. The toxicology tests that had been in the folder were not ignored in medical eyes, and a specialist's note called attention to discrepancies. Police were notified. Gail's evidence was logged and photographed. A will that had been intended as the final statement of a man's life turned into the primary piece of evidence in a criminal inquiry. The house where we had all been engulfed in memory became, in the record, the scene of an alleged crime. I should tell you here that I am not a legal expert. I am a cousin who sat at the table while family names were called into the air like coins flipped to decide fate. What I can tell you is what happened in the weeks after that evening. Relationships that had been built on decades of accumulation unraveled in a matter of months. Families split, lawyers sat like vultures in corners, and neighbors whispered outside closed curtains. Gail hired an attorney. My mother, who had always been proud but now was bruised, refused to return calls. There were whispered suggestions that money had motivated someone to interfere. There were claims that a man in pain would have chosen his own end differently. There were, as there are in so many of these cases, competing narratives, all of which could be true in part and false in part. And beneath it all was a question that every reasonable person asks. Did anyone intend to kill Uncle Ray? Or had someone administered something in a misguided attempt to help that turned out to be fatal? The medical report would eventually list a cause that read clinically. The police would file charges against names that once referred to family ties. But for that night, we sat hollowed by the knowledge that the house had become a theater of accusation, and that no one would get to leave with a simple sense of closure. The padlock, the envelope, the folder, these were objects that now meant more than they had an hour before. They were evidence and excuses both, and they would not be uncomplicatedly resolved. This is where I want to stop for a moment. At the dinner table, with the silverware still clinking, with the house's back door perhaps now a line that could not be crossed unmade. It's where the scene holds its breath and waits for the next thing to happen, an arrest, a confession, an explanation, or nothing at all. The rest of the story moves from the domestic to the judicial and back again, and it changes people in ways small and devastating. The will that was meant to settle estates became the hinge on which a family's life was torn apart. There are more nights to come.
More doors to peer at, more packages with strange ribbons, more routes where headlights fade and never return. But right now, it's that locked dining room and the echo of a fallen man that presses the hardest. The Christmas lights outside keep their steady pulse, ignorant of the quarrel within. When we come back to these stories, we'll pick up where the padlock closed and see what it meant for those named in the envelope and for the person who had to witness it all. For now, hold that picture in your mind, a family gathered for closure and instead trapped in a moment that rewrites their history. Think about the thinness of the things that usually hold us together: trust, consistency, easy explanations, and how quickly they can become brittle. There is a pattern here, a motif I keep returning to. Thresholds become tests. Doors, wills, roadways, Santa suits, all the objects that mean holiday comfort can be repurposed by someone with intent. Keep that in your mind as we move to the next story, which takes us from a closed dining room to the unnerving intimacy of unwanted gifts, parcels wrapped with your name that indicate someone has been in your house. It is one thing to lose a sitting meal. It is another to find evidence of someone reading the places you've kept private and choosing to leave a calling card. Wrapped in green,
It begins with something small, a bow that is too familiar, the exact same pattern as the one you use on your birthday presents. Christmas is a season of small rituals, and when one of those rituals is violated, the violation sits in your chest and won't let you breathe. Natalie. I lived on the 4th floor of a building that smelled faintly of old steam and new detergent. My tree was a Charlie Brown thing I'd bought on sale. It leaned with the tired grace of something that keeps you company because it has nowhere else to go. I worked late shifts at a gallery and kept odd hours. My friends were busy people. I liked the quiet the city gives you when it's snowing, the way it wraps around your building and makes the world seem like it's holding still for a minute. The first thing I noticed was a scarf. It was folded over the rung of my kitchen chair, a green wool with a thin silver thread through it. I picked it up, and the muscle memory of it was wrong. It smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. I had a scarf almost exactly like it, a cheap thing I brought on an impulse last winter and forgotten. It wasn't missing from where I imagined I'd left it, but the presence of the scarf where it shouldn't have been felt like a hand on my shoulder when nobody was there. At first I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor had found it in the laundry room and left it for me on a chair. Maybe I'd put it down and forgotten. But then other things started to appear. A matchbook from the coffee shop I always went to sat on top of my mailbox, even though I remembered paying for my own.
A postcard with my name, a childish looping hand that looked like someone had copied my address from a package, arrived in the mail. A small folded drawing, crayon drawn, of my apartment's layout, with the front door, the couch, the exact placement of my sink. The hallway was drawn with an arrow. I told myself to call the cops then, and I almost did. Instead, I called my friend Jenna, who laughed and said I was being dramatic. She suggested wine and told me not to be paranoid. We met, we drank, and I felt safer for a night. The next day, I found a box on my doorstep that had not been there when I left for work. It was wrapped in glossy green paper with a bow, the one I now recognized, and there was no postage, no courier slips, no note, just my name. I carried it upstairs like something alive. My hands trembled in a way I had only felt once before, and that was when a man had once smoked in the stairwell and flinched when someone came up the steps. I opened the box in the kitchen, careful, like you'd open an old photograph that might start to crumble if you touched it wrong. Inside was a kitchen knife wrapped in tissue, the blade sheathed in paper I recognized from my own drawer. I thought of the sound of tin sliding, the smallness of the blade compared to the feelings that swelled when I touched it. There was also a note folded small, a line of handwriting that read simply, "You forgot this." I called the building manager first because I was stupidly afraid of calling the police and being laughed at. He came up and checked the security footage for the lobby and the stairwell. The footage showed no one coming in with a package. The concierge downstairs swore she hadn't seen anyone and offered to call the other tenants. I felt my privacy being inspected by people who didn't understand the particular cold that settles when someone takes your small, private things and uses them like breadcrumbs. When I did call the police, they came with the kind of courtesy the job forces upon people who are experienced with calls that don't end in arrests. Detective Ames came in a coat too thin for December and a file folder that suggested he had seen similar things before. He listened and took notes and didn't laugh. He asked whether I had an ex, whether I'd argued with anyone lately, whether I had posted anything online that might have advertised my schedule. I answered honestly. I had dated in the past, but not recently. I had not posted my keys up for auction. My life was not the sort of thing that made headlines. They dusted for prints and took a photo of the green-wrapped gift without making a big show of it. They put the knife into evidence with the air of people removing something that might be connected to a greater story. The file they wrote had a neat label, "Stalker, possible." It felt to me like a cardboard box labeled in a storage unit. There, now it is categorized. The categorization didn't calm me.
The things escalated slowly at first, like someone tightening a band. A child's drawing of my bed one morning, with a dot marked at the exact foot where I put a rug. A receipt for a bakery I never visited tucked under my doormat. The worst was a photograph left on the kitchen counter. Me, asleep on my couch, the light of the television on my face. The photograph was not grainy like a camera caught at a distance. It was close. It showed the curl of my hair and the small mole on my jaw that I'd never even thought of as distinctive. I hadn't known such a thing could unsettle me until I saw it. Detective Ames took the photograph into his file and said the quiet things that feel like medical terms when they are about you. Surveillance photograph, illegal entry, trespass. He recommended changing locks and getting new curtains and not sleeping with the lights out. He tried to make practical, sensible suggestions, and I followed them with a methodical sort of fear. I swapped the lock on my apartment. I installed a motion sensor light outside my door.
I brought curtains that blocked the streetlight entirely. I altered my route to work as if I were a spy on assignment. I told myself these were small concessions for safety. The police ran what little they could and turned up the frustrating constancy of modern investigations. There were no prints on that knife, no discernible DNA on the postcard, and the building's cameras had been pointed in ways that made the back door shadowed. That meant two things, they told me. Either someone had inside access or someone was exceptionally careful. They spoke about inside access like a mechanic talking about an engine, dry and precise. They checked current and former employees of the building. They asked people in the neighborhood. They scanned social media for repeated patterns. Sometimes I felt watched by them in a way that made me small, like a specimen in a jar. Sometimes I felt watched by someone else. I relocated after 3 months. It was a small apartment closer to my work, tighter, cheaper, and with a concierge she signed for packages. I told myself I was pragmatic. I told myself I was choosing safety. I was also choosing to be less visible to someone with the leisure to memorize the routes I took to the market and the nights I left my light on. The police never made an arrest. Detectives came and left, sometimes with new words that sounded promising, and sometimes with the weightless resignation of a case that might not resolve. They told me that the pattern could not be traced to any single suspect, and that sometimes, horrifically, people choose to make other people feel unsafe without crossing a legal line that would make them removable. There were suggestions, theories, that a past tenant might have had a key, that a neighbor might have imbibed too much curiosity, that a delivery person could have been involved.
Each theory felt like a new bruise. Each time a detective said the word alleged, the world rearranged into a place where there were fewer certainties. I learned to live with the kind of hyper-awareness that eats at the back of your head. In a restaurant, I noticed when people sat facing the door and arranged their plates in a way that made exits visible. I learned the sound of my own doorknob and knew when a key clicked slightly off rhythm. Christmas was the hardest holiday after that. Lights that used to comfort me now seemed like small flags that announced the time when I'd be home alone. On nights when it snowed, I would stand at my curtained window and watch footprints outside, as if they were paragraphs, and I was trying to read a hidden letter. People asked me why I didn't sue, why I didn't press harder. The answers were practical, and also smaller and meaner. Investigations cost energy someone had to provide, and I did not have more courage in me than I had fear. There is also a shame that lives under the shame of being targeted. Shame that perhaps you did something wrong, or shared too much, or were simply too ordinary in a way that invited someone else's focus. The effect of such stalking is not explosive. It's incremental. It etches away at a person until their life is smaller because they have carved off the parts of it that feel like risk. I lost friends because my quiet fear became a tendency to cancel plans. I lost the ease of mental space that allowed me to be naive in small ways. I traded spontaneity for a schedule. I learned, in ways that are both practical and corrosive, what privacy costs. When I tell people now, they try to be comforting, the way people try to stitch a bruise, with bandages and soft words. They say, "Oh, that's terrible," and then drift to other news. The story becomes a whisper that doesn't hold the weight of the day-to-day. The detectives told me that not every case concludes with handcuffs and headlines. The worst ones are the ones that leave people living differently, and that difference grows like frost over time. You keep the green scarf in a drawer, sometimes, and sometimes you throw it out. You move to a new place and tell yourself you have agency. But the memory of a blade wrapped like a present does not fold neatly into a memory box. It sits like a kept object you are proud to own, but you're not proud. You are weary. You learn that the holidays can make anonymity into an instrument, and that the boxes under a tree can sometimes be messages rather than gifts. Gifts meant to delight can be turned into messages meant to unnerve. Something wrapped in green can be a token of affection or a warning. From the intimacy of a stalker's careful gifts, we now move to the open road, the famous, awful highway that links towns and towns of grieving relatives. Route 63 was where headlights faded and people vanished on Christmas Eve. For one sister, a photograph would start a chain that unspooled into something larger than one family. My brother worked as a mechanic and had a way with diesel engines that made old cars purr like kittens. He liked to travel light, never took much with him besides a pack, a flannel shirt, and a radio that never quite tuned in the right station. He always said that the journey was half the point, that roads were conversations. He was driving to see me on Christmas Eve. It was a short trip, the kind you made because you don't want to eat alone. He called earlier that afternoon. He was cheerful in that way brothers can be, teasing, short-winded, a laugh that ended sentences. He said he'd be there by evening. I drove out to meet him halfway because the weather had been sketchy and I didn't want him to be alone. When I pulled into the rest stop on Route 63, his car was not there. I figured he'd been delayed, that he would call. He did not. The next morning, a photograph arrived on my phone. It was of my brother's car on the side of Route 63, hood up, people milling at a distance. The photograph had been left in my mailbox like a puzzle piece with no edges. There was no note. The glove compartment had a receipt for gas. The driver's wallet was there. The shoes were folded in the back seat. What wasn't there was Craig. The police came. They looked at the photograph like others had looked at strange packages, with the same mixture of curiosity and dread. Officer Peterson took my statement. The small print of police work, the lists, the where were you questions, began to compress a life into a series of checkboxes. Someone had found his keys by the roadside, they said. Someone had seen headlights and then nothing at all. The highway camera at mile marker 47 had an image that suggested a car going off the road, and then someone walking away from it. The grain of the camera footage was coarse, like an old postcard, but the human shape was there, an arm, a dark coat, a movement away from the lights. That photograph on my phone, the one that had arrived overnight, connected us to other people who had received similar things. Names from a decade of unsolved disappearances began to cluster in my inbox, and someone from a support forum sent me a list of other missing persons, last seen on Route 63 on winter nights. There was a pattern. Patterns are what give investigators footholds. Detective Ames called and offered a mixture of procedural calm and private sorrow. He told me that the FBI would be brought in because of the pattern, and that sometimes patterns belong to a single person, a predator who has learned to use the slow rhythm of holiday travel to his advantage. The idea made the rest stop patterns feel smaller, the fluorescent lights more clinical. We are trained to think of travel as neutral, but certain routes on certain nights are the kind of dark that predators prefer.
The breakthrough came from a tip, a woman who had been cleaning a cabin that at first had not seemed connected to anything. She noticed a strange collection in a buried chest. Photographs, license plates, small tokens that matched descriptions of items missing from victims' homes. The FBI sent a team. They issued search warrants. They found a cabin that was not on any tourist brochure, insulated poorly, smelling faintly of machine oil and cedar, a place that had both hobbies and hoarding habits colliding. There were items that matched the missing folks' belongings. They called them trophies, a word the investigators used with clinical detachment. Roy Sutter's name came into the case then, identified through threads of evidence and a life that, when the investigators looked closer, fit the outline they had been suspecting. He had been someone who lived in an unremarkable town, and who, from the outside, could be a neighbor or a friend. The authorities said he had been identified, and later died by suicide while surrounded by FBI agents. That phrasing, rotely formal, landed in people's mouths like gravel. It was a culmination that felt both complete and deeply incomplete. When the cabin was searched, the paperwork said the bones of conclusions, items catalogued, photographs taken, and then the tragedy of a person found dead in what looked like a final, self-contained act. The FBI would later lay out a sequence of possessions and timelines to tie names to places and to explain, as best they could, the connections between a missing car on Route 63 and a man who had been living with the evidence of others in his space. My brother's remains were recovered weeks later, in a wooded area where the ground had the stubborn patience of seasonally thawed earth. They sent them back with care and with a dignity that felt to those of us left behind both necessary and insufficient. There is no ceremony that can fully stitch a life back together once a body is moved from being missing to being something you can bury. The rituals help, but they are small. The public reaction was a particular kind of ache. Headlines ran in cycles that seemed to delight in neatness. A suspect found, a pattern explained, closure declared. But closure in capital letters is a journalism shortcut. For families, it is an ongoing calibration between legal resolution and heartbreak. The identification of Roy Sutter and his subsequent death ended a hunt, but it did not end the work of grief. It did not erase the nights my mother spent scrolling through archived footage, or the way my sister would check the driveway at 3 a.m. The FBI agents were professional and courteous. One of them, a woman named Agent Morales, no relation to any other officer, sat with me for hours and explained the evidence in a way that was respectful but also painfully precise. She spoke of timelines and cell tower pings, and of how predators learn to work highways like tools.
They did not dramatize. They used analytic language to impose order on horror. When she mentioned how many other families were connected by similar thin threads, I felt like I was part of a quilt that was fraying at the edges. After the initial media storm, there was an exhaustion in our house. People expressed condolences and then dropped into the silence that follows an ordeal. Some were aggressive curiosity, others were reverence. Strangers sent me photos of my brother's smile taken from social media posts. The worst were the conspiracy forums that promised to dig up the truth, which made a kind of greed out of our mourning. It was as if the world had the appetite of a weather pattern. It came, it damaged, and then it moved on. My life changed. I stopped taking long drives alone. I learned to hate the sound of engines at night because they reminded me of his silhouette walking away from a broken vehicle. I would dream of headlights and empty back seats. I visited the place where his car had been found and imagined, with a cruelty that felt like bad faith, how easy crimes could be. A single moment, a misstep, a wrong turn. If there is a lesson, if lessons can be wrung from such things, it is the fragility of travel on nights when the world is supposed to be festive and forgiving. Highways can be invisible predators' garages, a place where the human is small and the machinery is big. The FBI closed a chapter, but my mourning is not a chapter. It is a long hedge I tend each winter. Host. Highways and houses. They both stage disappearances, but they use different instruments. One hides behind anonymity and speed, the other behind gifts and familiarity. From a long road we move to a square of town, where holiday costumes provide cover. A man in a maroon Santa suit, who used the season's anonymity to cloak intent. I had thought Santa was an emblem of safety when I was a child, the kind man who hands out sweets and takes pictures for small cheeks. But anonymity is a cloth that anyone can drape over themselves. Maroon Santa. That's the name the women in my town started using, because specific details were unnerving to repeat. There were multiple Santas that year at the festival in the town square, a volunteer station of red suits and cotton beards, and among them one man in a maroon outfit that seemed a shade darker than the rest. He wasn't official. He wasn't on the pamphlet. He was just there, like a stain on a white tablecloth. I was 26, home for the holidays and restless. The festival was low budget and charming in the way only small towns can manage. Hay bales, carolers, a fake chimney for children to feed their letter wishes into. I remember the smell of roasted chestnuts and the glow-up bulbs that had seen better decades. I remember thinking that nights like that reminded you how communities could gather and be soft to each other.
He approached me with a standard Santa smile, only his beard was a strandy fake and his voice a little too coarse. He offered a candy cane and said, "Merry Christmas," in a way that suggested it was as much a declaration as a wish. At first it felt normal. Then he lingered. He stood too close, leaned into the space between us, and the air smelled of cheap cologne and something metallic I couldn't name. He asked my age as if he were checking a box. He asked where I lived as if he were considering a route. I felt lightheaded because my brain does that upside-down thing when it registers danger in a familiar cloth. I smiled the way you smile when you want to seem polite, and then moved away. He watched me. I told myself that would be that. The festival is full of people, and people move on. But the next week, I found myself being bumped in the grocery store by someone wearing a maroon scarf. Later, walking to my car, a figure in a dark coat followed at a distance that should have been casual, but felt too close. The worst night came when I was alone, leaving the late shift at a diner. It had snowed, and the streets had the wet gloss of slush. I unlocked my car with a light in my hand, and felt the world close in. A van moved past slowly, and I saw, reflected in the glass of my car window, a shadow that belonged to no one I knew. He lunged at the driver's side and struck the window with a heavy sack as if to smash it. The glass didn't break fully, but it spiderwebbed in a way that made my heart do something I did not have words for. The sack thumped again. I hit the horn and screamed until the sound left me empty. People pulled over when they heard the noise. The man was gone, swallowed by the alleys. He left my car with the mark of his thumbs and the smear of his sleeves. When the police arrived, they found other reports. A woman who had felt hands on her back in the line for photos. Another who had been offered a special candy cane. A report that matched my description of the maroon suit and the way the man moved like someone who had practiced being invisible. In small towns, predators use the camouflage of ritual. A festival is an organized chaos where strangers become relatives for the span of a carol. The maroon suit allowed him to move among people, to watch, to choose a lone woman at the edges, and then test a boundary. The costume gave him an excuse. He could be dismissed as part of the scenery. That anonymity is a weapon. The police had trouble pinning him down because costumes don't leave much trace.
People said he could have been someone from out of town who'd rented a suit. He had the advantage of being a man who could melt into a crowd. The town council instituted stricter identification for volunteers at the next festival, and the rumor mill did the rest. Someone in a janitor's closet might be named. Someone else might be rumored to have left in a hurry. But rumors are poor companions of justice. I moved away within the year.
Not because the town condemned me, or because I couldn't look at the hay bales, but because the festival had turned into a scene that replayed in my head, a maroon blur against the glow of bulbs. There are ways the memory of a costume can latch onto your life, turning normal textures into alarms. I learned to check crowds for costumes, to prefer daylight, to avoid corners where someone might wait with a sack. Once a woman stopped me on a bus years later and said, "You too?" in a way that made both of us shiver, with a recognition that felt like blood. It binds you, these small, cruel memories, into a community of people who've been brushed by the same cloth, and those shared experiences are salves and scars at once. We warn each other in grocery lines and at hairdressers, and sometimes we simply avoid places where costumes have been used as cover. A Santa suit should be a sign that the world has softer corners. Instead, in that town, it became a mask. Masks hide intention. They also allow predators to play roles. Our final story takes place in the private vertical world of the apartment building, a narrow metal ladder from one floor to another, a ledge, a face pressed to glass on a cold December night. I had always thought of fire escapes as architectural poetry, a place for a cat to sun itself and for a smoker to gather breath. I discovered how thin their poetry could be when someone decided to use them as a stage for intimidation. The ledge. First person. Tenant. I moved into the building because it was cheap and because the landlord had an old record collection in the basement I could borrow from. My apartment overlooked the narrow lane between two brick facades, a place where pigeons like to judge the world. I liked the place because it felt slightly cinematic, the kind of apartment you might see in a movie, where something small, intimate, and terrible happens. The first time I noticed something wrong, it was a sound in the hall at night. The knob on my neighbor's door turned, then turned the other way, as if someone were testing it. In winter, you learn the rhythms of a building, which pipes bang and when, which neighbor's laugh carries, which footsteps belong to strangers. The turn of the knob was not normal. It was deliberate and rhythmic. Left, right, left, right, as if someone were trying to learn the mechanism. I told myself it was the building settling. I told myself I was being dramatic because it was Christmas, and people are lonely, and sometimes loneliness makes you suspicious. But then someone rapped on my window with one knuckle, in a slow, polite Morse that made my skin feel too thin. I pulled the curtains and peered out, and saw a silhouette on the fire escape, a man who looked like someone who practiced being patient. He was testing the locks on windows, like someone who loved the anatomy of small openings. I called the police.
They came with a courteous exhale and took my statement with a pen that scratched softly across paper. They told me to keep my curtains closed. They told me the usual things. Change locks, call if he returns. They left, and I sat with the curtains drawn, like a shoebox that kept me contained. He returned the next night. He walked along the iron, measured by a slow foot, and stopped at my level. He knocked on the glass, soft as a lover, and then pressed his face to it. I could see him, his breath fogging on the pane, his eyes not quite visible, but those contours of a face I could not name. He had a patient look, as if he enjoyed the possibilities of a person he had watched for a long time. I remember acting in ways I now understand as both brave and instinctive. I turned on every light in the apartment, I yelled, and I banged pots together to make noise. The clatter had a ridiculous comic quality to it in the moment. The man didn't run. He paused and then slid away down the iron ladder. I saw him go into the dark, and I felt the building close its breath like a mouth. Neighbors came to their windows. Someone flashed a flashlight in the hall. It was like a communal vigil, small and practical. When the police finally arrived, they had been on another call. They spoke with a kind of delayed professionalism that made my heart sink and my gratitude taut at the edges. They found no one. The footprints on the rusted steps were ephemeral in the frost, and the man was gone. Later, the landlord distributed a notice that there had been suspicious activity and that tenants should be vigilant.
The notice was the kind of mild bureaucracy that pretends to be reassurance. It felt like putting a coat on a wound. The man returned again a week later. This time he brought a small ladder to the building, which is something I tell people now because it illustrates his patience and preparation more than anything dramatic did. He climbed to the platform and tested the window latch until it yielded, as if the building were a door with pockets of memory waiting to be written into. He pressed his cheek to the glass, and you could see him breathing into it, one slow, unhurrying exhalation. That image, a man's face literally warmed against the pain of my life, is the thing that has never left me. I managed to get my neighbor's attention. She lived across the hall and left her light on as a signal. Her car's headlights swept across the alley, and the man froze as if someone had taken a photograph of him mid-sin. He climbed away with the kind of composed slowness of someone who doesn't flinch when a plan might fail. He left without a struggle, but the speed he left at was not a fast sprint. It was a steady slide into the night. The police came after someone called from across the street. He was never caught. The police said the man was likely local and might have been watching the building for some time.
They searched records and ran a check on people with restraining orders in the area. It was one of those investigations that landed in a gap between suspicious and criminally prosecutable. He had not broken into my apartment. He had not physically assaulted me. He had committed a kind of intimate trespass that the law can prosecute, but which is often left in the purgatory of not quite. I moved 2 months later. The landlord finally fixed the latch and installed a new intercom that required a code. The building felt better in ways I could point to. A new lock, a notice that said no loitering on fire escape. But the fear doesn't vanish with a lock. It takes with it a residue, a set of new habits. I stopped leaving my curtains open in daylight. I began to take the long way home, down streets that had more people. I learned to sleep with a phone on my pillow. People said I was lucky I had called, that my neighbor's lights had helped, that the police had responded as best they could. I am grateful for those things, but gratitude sits next to guilt, the small, shameful thought that maybe I had invited attention somehow by living the life I did. That is the cruel part of these stories. The victims spend time accusing themselves because the rest of the world is quick to imagine explanations that are easier than admitting random malice exists. There has been no arrest as far as I know. The man on the ledge remains a figure in the stairwell of my memory. Sometimes I wonder if he ever migrates the way migratory birds do, moving on when the season is over. Most nights I think of him as someone who liked the architecture of access. The image I keep is of breath fogging the window, and the way the light inside turned his face into a thing that looked like somebody else's sorrow. 6 stories, 6 thresholds, a dark house on a street of lights, a dinner that became a cross-examination, gifts that were messages, a highway that turned into a hunting ground, a holiday disguise that cloaked menace, and a fire escape that became an instrument of dread. There are patterns here, because people are patterns. They prefer predictable places where other people's defenses are down. Holidays, festivals, roads lined with cars, homes with open doors, apartments with old latches. The details differ. A ribbon, a padlock, a photograph, a maroon suit, but the quiet sameness is the same. A predator sees a weak hinge and pushes. And yet, in each story, there is a human story that resists being filed neatly. Survivors carry forward with complicated practicalities, relocations, court appearances, media attention, police investigations that close in ways that feel both satisfying and insufficient. Some cases end in arrest and conviction. Some end in the discovery of a cabin full of trophies and a man who dies surrounded by agents. Some never conclude in ways that feel final.
In all of them, the cost is personal: isolation, distrust, the quiet rearrangement of one's life. I want to close with a few honest points. If you see something that seems wrong, tell someone. That doesn't mean put yourself in harm's way. It means call a neighbor, call an officer, document evidence if you can safely do so. Your attention matters. But attention also can have costs, as we saw in the Donnelly case, where witness involvement reshaped lives in ways that were both necessary and painful. If you or someone you know is living through any of these situations, stalking, being followed, finding strange packages, there are resources and hotlines and professionals who can guide steps you can take that prioritize both safety and legal standards. And if you are a friend of someone in the middle of such a thing, the best gift you can give is presence without judgment. People will make decisions based on fear or practicality. Keep the human with them. Keep offering warmth, meals, a place to sit. These stories are not meant to scare you into paranoia, but to remind you that the holidays, while buoyant with tradition and goodwill, can amplify isolation and create cover for people with harmful intent. Small things, a locked door, a neighbor checking in, a camera in a common hall, can make a difference. But there are no bulletproof measures. Vigilance is not heroism, it is caution. Courage is not an absence of fear, it is aligning action with the best information you have. If you found these stories important, or if they struck a chord, please subscribe and check the playlist linked at the end for more episodes like this. Share these accounts with someone who needs to hear them. Sometimes the smallest warning shapes someone's choices. For those grieving tonight, for those who have moved and put their lives back in order with new curtains and new locks and cautious hope, I see you. These nights are long. They are made longer by the questions that have no answers, and the small, sustainable acts of living that continue despite a changed world. We will return to seasonal shadows in another episode. For now, keep your doors in mind. Watch the thresholds you pass each night, and guard the small rituals that mean safety to you. If you can, be kind to your neighbor. Sometimes kindness is the thin light that prevents a darker thing from moving in. Thank you for staying through these 6 stories. If you want to hear more, the playlist is linked. Subscribe so you don't miss the next set. Share this episode with someone who might need to hear these warnings, and take care of each other this season.